I have carried this for 33 years, and I want you to understand something before I say another word. I am not a man who tells stories he cannot stand behind. I spent 18 years as a section foreman for CN Rail, which means I spent 18 years being the person responsible for whether a track was safe enough to put 100 tons of steel across at 60 miles an hour. That work does not leave room for wishful thinking. You are precise, or people die. So when I tell you that my father was kept alive in the Selkirks in the winter of 1952 by something that brought him dressed game meat 3 times across 6 weeks of starvation, I am telling you the most exact version of a true thing that I know how to tell. His name was Hector Coleman. He died in 1991 in a hospital bed in Revelstoke, 68 years old, and he told me this account on the 2nd day after his surgery, when he was still enough on the medication that his hands shook, but his memory was perfectly clear. He made me promise not to repeat it until anyone who might have used it against the creature was gone. I have honored that. The men from that camp are dead. The supervisors are dead. I am 71 years old and I have spent 33 years deciding when the time was right. And I have decided tonight is the time. I need to take you back to where it started. To understand what my father told me from that hospital bed, you need to know the world he lived inside and what it took for a man like him to say any of it out loud at all. My father came to the CN section gangs in 1946, the year after the war ended. He was 23 years old. He had grown up outside of Sycamus in a family that kept horses and ran a small amount of cattle, and he was not a man with extensive formal schooling, but he was built for hard physical work, and he was steady, which the rail camps valued more than almost anything else. The work in that era was grading, tamping, tie replacement, and drainage clearing, mostly done by hand with a small amount of machinery that broke down constantly in cold weather. The pay was reasonable for the era. The accommodations ranged from adequate to genuinely rough depending on the posting. And the men who lasted more than a few seasons were the ones who understood that the mountain country did not care about your preferences or your schedule. My father worked the Rogers Pass corridor for most of his time with CN, 18 years in total, from 1946 until he finally took a foreman job with a small contractor in 1964 and stopped living in camps altogether. He knew that country the way you know something you have been inside for a long time, not as scenery, but as a working environment with specific moods and specific dangers. He knew which drainages avalanched early in the season and which ones held until March. He knew which rock faces shed ice in a certain temperature range. He knew how much snow it took to close the supply road up from Revelstoke, and he knew from experience how long a closure could last. I ended up doing similar work on the same corridor for 18 years myself, which is partly why I can tell you his account with some confidence that I understand what he is describing. When he said the watchman's shelter at the east end of the trestle was positioned below an overhanging rock face that kept it out of the worst wind, I know exactly the kind of structure he meant. When he described the sound of the creek under ice at night, I know that sound. I am not embellishing his account. I am translating it into detail, and I have spent 33 years making sure I had the detail right before I said any of it aloud to anyone. Pepper just shifted at my feet. She is a border collie, 7 years old, and she has been asleep since I sat down to tell this. I mention her because she is the only witness to this telling, besides you. The winter of 1952 into 1953 was a hard one in the Selkirks. That is not unusual for that country, but that particular winter ran cold and heavy from early November, which accelerated the avalanche cycle ahead of the normal schedule. The CN gang my father was working with that season had been staged up above Revelstoke in early October to do fall maintenance on a section of track that included an older timber trestle over a creek drainage. The trestle had developed some problems across the previous spring with the pier footings, and there was work planned to shore the structure before winter loads. My father's crew got most of that work done, but not all of it because a slide came down across the supply road in the first week of December, earlier than anyone in camp had expected, and that closed the road. I eventually found records in the CN archives, which I spent 2 days going through in 1994 because I needed to verify what my father had told me against something documentary. The road closure is there, recorded in a maintenance log for that posting. 14 men in camp on December 7th. Supply run scheduled for December 12th, not completed due to road. Next, completed supply delivery, February 19th. That is a gap of 69 days. The camp had food stores for approximately 30 days of normal consumption. The records note that hunting by camp personnel supplemented rations through January, which is consistent with what my father described, but the tone of the notation is dry and administrative, the way records written by a man trying not to alarm his supervisors tend to sound. What the record does not say, and what my father told me, is that by the end of January, the main camp was on less than half rations, and one of the older men had become too weak to work. Now, here is the detail that matters for what I am about to tell you. The trestle had not been cleared for full train traffic because of the footing work that had not been completed. CN practice in that era, when you had a structure that had been flagged as conditionally serviceable, was to post a watchman at the structure during overnight hours when any train movement was expected. The watchman's job was simple and not complicated. He stayed at or near the structure. He listened and watched for anything that suggested a problem, and if a train was coming, he had a lantern signal system to stop it if needed. It was not a dangerous job under normal circumstances. It was a cold and isolated job. My father drew that posting 3 times across January and into February of 1953. The watchman's shelter at the east end of the trestle was roughly 2 miles from the main camp. 2 miles by trail in full winter gear with a pack, in the dark, in temperatures that my father remembered as regularly reaching -20 Fahrenheit. He said you could do it in about 40 minutes if the trail was packed, longer if new snow had fallen. The arrangement was that he would go out in the late afternoon, stay through the overnight hours until no further train movement was expected in the early morning, and walk back to camp. The first time he drew the posting in mid-January, the ration situation in camp had become uncomfortable but not critical. He went out with food for roughly 2 days, because the posting could extend if a train was delayed, and it was not worth making the walk twice. He said the shelter was small, maybe 8 feet by 10, with a sheet iron stove that took spruce rounds and kept the space tolerably warm if you fed it consistently. There was a bunk against the wall. There was a lantern hook near the door. There was a window that faced the trestle approach, small and set high in the wall, so you could check the track without going outside every time. He served that first posting without incident. He said the nights were very quiet. The creek under the trestle made a low ticking sound through the ice in certain temperature ranges, and a deeper groaning sound when it was colder, and he learned to use those sounds as a kind of rough thermometer. He walked back to camp on the second morning, and nothing unusual had happened. The second posting came in late January, after about 2 more weeks had passed. By this point, the rations situation had become genuinely difficult. My father said the cook, a man named Roy who had worked CN camps for a long time, and who was not a man given to complaint, had started cutting the portions in a way that was visible even to someone not paying close attention. My father went out for the second watchman posting with less food than the first time, because there was simply less food to take. He said he had bread that was stale and a small amount of dried meat and some tea. enough for a day and a half if he was careful. He was at the shelter for 3 nights that second posting, because a train movement got delayed out of Revelstoke by mechanical problems at the yard, and the expected schedule kept shifting. On the second morning of those 3, he woke early before the light was fully up and found a package outside the shelter door. He described it to me as wrapped in bark. He said it was a piece of fresh inner bark, the kind that peels off a fir tree in a wide, flexible sheet, folded over and around something, and held in place by a strip of the same bark. He said when he opened it he found a hindquarter from something in the deer family, a mule deer or a whitetail, he could not be certain which, and that the joint where the leg had been separated from the carcass was clean and deliberate, in a way that told him whoever or whatever had processed it knew what they were doing. Not a jagged break, not a tear, a dressed cut. The meat was frozen on the outside and still cold at the center, which told him it had been left not long before he found it, probably in the last hours of darkness. He stood there in the door of the shelter, he told me, for a considerable period of time, looking at the snow in front of the door. There were no tracks. That is the detail I have spent 33 years returning to, and I want to be precise about what my father said. He was not saying there were no footprints visible in packed-down trail snow where you might not expect them. He was saying that the snow immediately in front of the shelter door, which had a fresh dusting from overnight, showed no marks except his own boot prints from the night before when he had stepped outside briefly to check the lantern. He checked the perimeter of the shelter. He walked the 20 or 30 feet to each side. He was not a careless observer, my father. He was a man who spent his working life in country where reading ground told you things you needed to know. He found nothing. And he said that was the moment he understood this was not something he could explain in the ordinary way. Now, I have worked through the rational explanations, and I want you to know I have done this seriously, not as a formality. I have done it the way I would work through a track failure, systematically, with the intention of finding the explanation that fits. The most obvious one is bear. A bear disturbs you in late January in the Selkirks, and my answer to that is that in January in that country a bear is denned deep, not walking the high slopes with a processed deer hindquarter looking for places to leave it. The behavior is wrong, the season is wrong, and a bear would have eaten what it had. The second explanation I considered and spent real time on is that someone from the main camp brought the meat out to him as a private kindness and did not want to be acknowledged for it, which is the kind of thing that actually does happen among men in hard circumstances. But 2 miles in the dark at -20, leaving a package at a door without waking the man inside, and then walking back without leaving a mark in fresh overnight snow, is not something a camp worker in standard gear was doing. The third explanation I turned over for a long time is that my father's memory of the tracks was wrong, that he was hungry and cold, and the morning was dark, and he simply did not look carefully enough. I know my father. He was not the kind of man who made careless observations about things that mattered. He checked the snow. He told me exactly how he checked it. The no tracks detail is the one part of his account I cannot reduce to something I understand, and I have stopped pretending otherwise. He took the meat inside and cooked it on the sheet iron stove, and ate a portion, and walked back to camp with the rest. He did not tell anyone where the meat had come from. He told Roy the cook that he had set a snare on the way out and got lucky, which was not an unusual explanation in that camp at that time. Roy apparently nodded and put the meat into the pot without further comment, the way a practical man does when luck arrives, and questions would cost him something. The third posting came in the middle of February, about 3 weeks later. By then, the main camp was in a genuinely bad condition. My father said the man who had gone weak earlier, whose name I was never told, was not improving, and there was real concern about whether he would get out of the winter without proper food. My father went to the trestle shelter that third time with almost nothing. He said he had enough for one meal, and he did not know if the posting would run 1 night or 3. And he went anyway, because that was the job. The third posting ran 2 nights, and on both mornings there was meat outside the door. The first morning it was the same arrangement as before. Bark wrapped, a portion of something from the deer family, left before the light, no tracks in the fresh snow. The second morning it was different. It was a larger piece, what my father thought was a whole shoulder from something larger, possibly elk, and it was not wrapped. It was simply placed on a flat piece of rock that sat beside the shelter door, the rock that the watchman used as a step. Set there the way you would set something down on a table, deliberately. My father ate before he looked around that morning. He told me that detail himself, with something that I can only describe as a dry awareness of what it said about him, that a hungry man feeds himself before he investigates. After he ate, he went outside and spent time looking at the area around the shelter in the full morning light, which was better light than he had had the other mornings. And that was the morning he saw the figure. Not close. He was clear about the distance. He put it at roughly 100 yards, up the slope above the shelter, in the timber that came down from the high country to within about 40 feet of the rock wall behind the structure. He said it was standing still when he first saw it. Standing at the tree line, not inside the trees, at the point where the timber ended and the open slope began. He said it was very large. Not the large of a big man, but a different order of large, the kind that your eyes try to reduce to something familiar, and cannot. Dark colouring. Dark enough that against the dark of the spruce trees it was almost invisible, but the slope below the timber was snow-covered, and the contrast was enough that he could see it clearly. He said it did not move when he looked at it. He stood, and it stood, and there was a period of time that he could not quantify to me. It might have been 30 seconds, and it might have been 3 minutes, during which neither of them moved. He said the thing that stayed with him from that moment, the thing he had carried for the better part of 40 years before he told me, was not fear. He said he had been prepared to feel fear. He said what he actually felt was something closer to being acknowledged, which was a word he used very carefully, because my father was not a man who reached for words like that easily. Then it stepped back into the trees and was gone. He walked back to camp that day with the shoulder wrapped in his canvas pack bag, and he told Roy he had got lucky at the snare again. And Roy looked at the size of the piece and looked at my father and said nothing beyond thank you, which I think is the most Roy ever said about the situation. The road was cleared on February 19th. I found that date in the CN archives. A supply truck reached the camp on the 20th, and my father walked out on the 22nd with the rest of the crew. The maintenance log records the crew departure and notes that all personnel were in adequate health. That phrase, adequate health, is the kind of thing a supervisor writes when the real condition of his people was worse than he wanted in the record. My father came home to Revelstoke weighing 148 pounds, which he told me himself, and which his doctor at the time apparently noted with concern. He was 5'11". He should have weighed closer to 175. The supply records I found in the CN archives told a fairly clear story. The camp's food stores, including what the men supplemented by hunting through January, should have been exhausted by roughly the 10th of February, based on the quantities logged in and the crew size. They were not exhausted. The cook's inventory notes from the supply handover on February 20th show a small remaining quantity of dried goods, and the meat the cook accounted for as used in the final 2 weeks of the closure represents more than the hunting record should have produced. I am not saying those records prove anything. Records like that are not precise enough to prove anything. What I am saying is that they are consistent with what my father told me, which is that something was supplementing what the camp had, specifically at the trestle shelter, specifically in the last hard weeks of that winter. He came home. He was quieter than he had been before. Ruth, my mother, noticed it within a week. She told me that herself, 30 years later, sitting at the kitchen table in the house in Revelstoke that she and my father had shared since 1955. She said she had known immediately that something had happened to him that winter. Not something bad in the way of injury or illness, but something that had changed the way he moved through the world. She said he was quieter in a particular way, not depressed, not withdrawn, but careful. The way a man becomes careful when he is holding something that he does not know where to put. She spent 38 years asking him, in the way long marriages develop their own forms of asking, and he spent 38 years not answering. I want to say something about that silence because it has weighed on me. My father was not a dishonest man. He was not secretive by temperament. He was a man who kept his word. And I believe he had decided in some form, perhaps not consciously, perhaps just as a working principle, that talking about what had happened would put the thing at risk. In some way, he could not precisely articulate. He did not know what to call it. He did not have a category for it. He had a category for bears and for men, and for the odd things that happened in mountain country sometimes, and this did not fit any of those. So he kept it. The way you keep something you are not sure is yours to spend. He told Ruth in their last winter together, which was 1990 to 1991. He had been having chest problems since the fall, and they both knew the surgery was coming. And I think he decided that 38 years of her wondering deserved an answer before anything uncertain happened. She told me he had sat with her at that same kitchen table and told her most of it, not all of it, but enough. She said she had cried, which was not something she did easily. Not from fear and not from grief, but from something she described to me as being relieved, which I understood. 38 years of knowing your husband is holding something is its own weight. He survived the surgery. He was in the hospital for 11 days. I came up from Kamloops, where I was working a section foreman posting at the time, on the third day after the procedure. He was alert and his hands shook slightly from the medication, and he looked at me from the bed and said, without any introduction, that there was something he needed me to know. He told me the account over about an hour. I did not interrupt him. He was precise about the things he was sure of, and he said plainly when he was reconstructing something from memory that might not be exact. He told me about the first package, and about the no-tracks morning, and about his rational attempts to explain it. He told me about the 3 weeks between the second and third posting, during which he had gone about his work in the camp, in a state he described as watchful, a word I recognized from his way of being in the world because I had grown up with it. He told me about the 2 mornings of the third posting, and about the morning he saw the figure at the Treeline. He told me what it had looked like in the same careful, qualified way that he told me everything else, which is part of why I believe him. He did not make it larger than it was. He did not give it qualities that served the story. He said it was very large, dark-haired from what he could see at that distance, and that it stood the way something stands when it is not trying to be invisible, not hidden, present, and that when it stepped back into the timber, it moved without any sound that reached him across 100 yards of open snow, which, given the conditions, should have carried sound reasonably well. He told me why he had not said anything for 38 years, which was not a single reason, but several folded together. He said partly it was the promise he had made to himself that he would not give anyone a reason to go looking for it in the way that would end badly for the creature. He said partly it was that he did not have words for it that would not make him sound like a man whose judgment had been affected by a hard winter. And he said partly it was that the experience had been given to him in some form he could not explain, that something had made a decision about him without any reason to, and that talking about it cheaply felt like a violation of that. Then he told me not to repeat it, while anyone from that era who might use it was still alive. He meant the men from the camp and the supervisors, and anyone who might have had a professional or financial interest in the territory up above Revelstoke. He said not long, just until the circle was small enough that the account couldn't do harm. I kept that. I am a man who keeps his word, which I come by honestly. My mother died in 1997. My father had been gone 6 years by then, and I watched her go holding on to the kitchen table version of the story he had finally given her. And I was glad he had told her before the surgery, because she went easier for knowing it. She never stopped believing him. Not for a day after he told her. She said to me once in her last year that it explained something about him she had wondered about for a long time, which was why he had never been able to explain to anyone why he had a specific kind of patience with the country up above town. He would not hunt in certain drainages. He had his reasons, and he never stated them, but he held them. The last of the men I knew from that camp era, a retired CN worker I had crossed paths with occasionally over the years, named Walt Curry, died in the spring of 2022. Walt had not been at that camp in 1952, but he had known some of the men who were, and he was one of the last links to that circle my father had described. When I heard Walt had passed, I sat with it for several months. I thought about what my father had asked me to hold and why he had asked me to hold it, and I thought about the 33 years of carrying it, and I decided that the weight of it had been transferred to me long enough. There is no one left to use it against the thing that helped my father stay alive. There is no practical harm left in the telling. Pepper just lifted her head. She has been asleep since I sat down, and she just lifted her head and turned it towards the window on the north side of the room, which looks out toward the dark of the hillside above the house. She's not alarmed. Her ears are up, and her posture is easy. She is simply attending to something I cannot hear, the way a dog does when the world outside is making a sound below the threshold of a person's notice. She has done that a few times over the years, at this house, in the night, and I have stopped making much of it except to notice it. I notice it now. Here is what I want you to understand if you have stayed with me this long. My father was not a man who exaggerated. I knew him for 44 years, and I worked in the same industry in the same country for 18 of those years, and I never once caught him in a thing he said that did not hold up to scrutiny. He was the most careful person about claims that I ever knew, which is part of the inheritance of working in a trade where a wrong claim about a structure can put people in the ground. He told me this account one time, from a hospital bed, and he held to the same standard he held to everything else, which was that he said what he knew, and he said clearly what he didn't know, and he did not fill the gaps with invention. The gaps in my father's account are there if you look for them. He did not know what the thing was. He did not know why it chose him, if chose is even the right word, and I want to be careful with that, because I am not certain the concept of choosing applies cleanly to something I have no way to understand from the inside. What I know is what the ration records show, and what my father weighed when he came out of that country, and what he described from 100 yards of open snow in the morning light of a February morning in 1953. Something in those mountains in that hard winter made a repeated and deliberate decision to leave food at a shelter where a man was starving. 3 times. Dressed meat, properly processed. Left before dawn. No tracks. My father believed, and I believe him, that the thing he saw at the tree line was the same thing that had left the meat. I cannot prove that. He could not prove it. What he could say was that when it looked at him from the tree line and he looked back at it, he did not feel he was being watched by something indifferent. He said that was the thing he had never found a way to explain. Not the size of it, not the tracks it did not leave, but the quality of being looked at by something that had, for reasons entirely its own, decided he was worth the trouble. That is the account. That is what I have been carrying for 33 years, in the same careful, heavy way my father carried it for 38 before me. 71 years between his first winter on the rail gangs and this night, and the story is finally out in the open air where it can breathe. I am not asking you to believe it. My father did not ask the cook to believe it. He asked the cook to use the meat, which was the practical thing, and that was enough. The CN archives have the closure dates. They have the ration logs. They have the notation about adequate health on the crew exit record. Everything I have told you about the documentary side of this account has a record behind it that a careful person could find if they knew where to look. The rest of it lives in the account my father gave me, which I have held to and tried to do justice to in this telling. Pepper just set her head back down on her paws. Whatever she heard has quieted. The window is dark, and the hillside above this house is exactly as it always has been, which is to say deep and patient and full of things I cannot account for. From in here by the lamp. My father got to go back to that country for 18 more years after that winter. He walked those drainages and worked those grades and knew that country in the particular intimate way you know ground you have been paid to understand. I think, though I cannot know this and he never said it to me directly, that those were the best 18 years of his working life. Not easier, not safer, just different in some quality that I suspect had to do with knowing that the country had something in it that had once turned in his direction and chosen, for reasons of its own, to be kind. I have worked that same country. I have walked those grades at night with a lantern and stood at trestle ends in February cold and listened to creeks running under ice. I have never seen what my father saw, but I have stood in those places knowing what he told me, and I can tell you that the knowing changes the quality of the standing. The dark timber above the right-of-way looks the same as it always did. I have simply stopped assuming that nothing in it is paying attention. If you have sat with something like this, something the world had no clean category for, but that you know in your bones was real, you will understand why a man carries it the way my father carried it, and the way I have carried it after him. Not as a burden exactly, as a responsibility. You were given a true thing that the world is too small to hold without damage, and so you hold it yourself, and you are careful with it, and you wait until the time is right, and then you put it somewhere it can live on without you. Pepper is asleep, the lamp is steady, and I am done keeping this.